It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, and this is Monster Mondays presented by Film Seizure. As we arrive on a tropical island where a mysterious man dressed in all white works on science, soon we will discover that maybe the kind of science this mysterious man takes part in is a bit ghastly. And we'll have to ask ourselves, are we not men? The year is 1932. The movie is The Island of Lost Souls. The film would be the first English-language adaptation of H.G. Wells' 1896 science fiction novel, The Island of Dr. Moreau. The book was released at a very interesting time in biological science. Recently, there had been a growing conversation in Europe around vivisection of animals. There had been laws passed in the second half of the 19th century in the UK, but neither scientist in favor of vivisection or the animal protection groups against it were all that happy with the laws. In short, the scientists felt that the laws in England restricted them from being able to study ailments and various other things effectively. For those who were against vivisection, they didn't feel like it went far enough in preventing it, only just a kind of half measure. At least they weren't allowed to cut open living animals anymore. Now, another topic of debate during this period of time was the idea around what's called degeneration. The theory of degeneration in biology is about the idea that complex organisms devolving from a complex to a simpler, less differentiated form. It's probably more often discussed in social terms. Basically mass shifts in urbanization and other activities that seem to be changing hereditary lines and potentially breaking down class systems and so forth. And this was a part of a system of belief that many biologists and social scientists believed, but it didn't really hold true for one very important person, and that important person would be Charles Darwin. Darwin's theory of evolution was a very hot topic. In fact, it may be one of the very last theories that would be seen as heretical by just about any evangelical offshoot of Christianity. I think we know what Darwin's theory is all about. Well, combine all these things, and Wells saw an opportunity for a great story. Some of the themes covered in the book deal with cruelty of animals, moral responsibility, identity, and humans basically mucking about with nature. It's one of the earliest examples of a sci-fi trope called uplift. And that means that a higher creature, in this case man, accelerates another creature's evolutionary track, making the altered creature more than what they were before. The Island of Dr. Moreau remains one of the most popular novels written by Wells in a career that almost seems littered with beloved books. And it's kind of famously known that Wells really did not like this adaptation that this 1932 version did, even though it's very highly regarded by critics even today. Wells thought that it kind of cheapened his story by going more for horror elements, but that's fair. I mean, he created this very deep book about all these different things, and Paramount essentially just kind of turned it into a horror movie. But I also find it interesting that this, as I said, was originally released as a Paramount Pictures movie. However, when I first watched this in the mid-90s, I watched it as part of the Universal Classic Horror series that was mostly highlighted with the classic monsters as mascots on top of each of the VHS releases. I suspect at some point Paramount sold off some of its catalog to Universal. Even my much more recent Criterion Collection Blu-ray of this movie starts with the Universal logo from the 90s and then the Paramount logo from the 30s at the beginning of the movie. And I do think that Universal and Paramount probably had some kind of relationship over the years, as they originally shared 50-50 ownership of USA Network. So somewhere along the way, home video distribution rights for Island of Lost Souls went to Universal. The movie begins with a shipwrecked traveler named Edward Parker getting picked up by a freighter that is making a delivery to the island of Dr. Moreau. The crates being delivered are full of big cats like lions and tigers, as well as gorillas, wolves, etc. The freighter's captain wasn't aware of Parker's presence on the boat until the next morning because he was completely blitzed the night that they picked him up. But he's not so happy about the boat being loaded with the animals either. The captain thinks Moreau is a ghoul, but Mr. Montgomery, a man who works for Moreau and charters these shipments of the animals, believes that Moreau to be a good, honorable, and brilliant scientist. Montgomery has a servant with him by the name of Meling, who has curious animalistic features. And when the captain is cruel to Meling and Parker knocks him out, that creates a little bit of a rift going forward, particularly for Parker. When the freighter makes the delivery, the captain decides to make sure Parker goes with him by just tossing him off his ship onto Moreau's boat. Moreau tells Parker that he will let him take a boat to the closest pier the next morning so that he can ultimately return to his girlfriend. Moreau says that Mr. Montgomery is a fair enough sailor and that he can give him, quote, enough of a crew, unquote. On the island, Moreau takes Parker to his house, and on the way, several of the beast men that Moreau has created show themselves in the trees, but Moreau uses a whip to basically keep them away and kind of keep them healed, if you will, and kind of just leave them back in the trees so that they don't attack Parker or they don't try to do anything to Moreau. At the house, Moreau introduces Parker to the very lovely animalistic Lotta. And they hear screaming from a room that Lotta calls the House of Pain, and Parker believes Moreau is vivisecting humans, and that's why they are looking like a combination of people and animals. Parker and Lotta find an encampment of beastmen, and the leader of the beastmen, known as the Sayer of the Law, and he recites Moreau's laws that essentially makes these anthropomorphized animals something more of a society of humans than what they were before. Moreau explains to Parker that he began working in gene manipulation in London. He was able to turn plants into something that they would ultimately become in about 100,000 years. He decided to turn to working on animals. Medical student Montgomery came with him because Montgomery was wanted for some unspoken professional indiscretion. His first success was to give these creatures speech. Later, when Lotta kisses Parker, she inadvertently scratches him with claws that have protruded from her fingers like a cat's. Parker tells Moreau that he's a bit more of a monster than he lets on for creating a thing like her who believes that she's a human and nothing else. Moreau says she is indeed a human, and his crowning achievement. She loves, she cries, she feels. He says that she was going to be with him when he makes his triumphant return to London to prove he wasn't insane. Parker's fiancée Ruth arrives on the island with the help of a kind sailor to get Parker. However, Moreau says it's far too late now for them to leave that night, so they must stay and leave in the morning. Oron, an ape-like creature, tries breaking into Ruth's room. It's heavily implied that this is Moreau's doing, that he put Oron up to this. With the help from the ship captain that brought Ruth and Mr. Montgomery, an escape attempt is mounted, but Moreau tells Oron to find them and strangle each one of the people trying to escape. Oron kills the sailor and brings his body to the Beastmen, where he's initially scolded by the Sayer of the Law. However, Oron convinces the tribe that they don't really need to follow Moreau's laws anymore. Eventually, Moreau, unable to calm the Beastmen back into obedience, is taken to the House of Pain, where the Beastmen cut him apart with his own instruments. Montgomery helps Ruth and Parker to escape, but Lotta tries to get rid of Oron, but they are both killed in the ensuing struggle. And the entire island burns, presumably wiping out Moreau's research and study. So let's get to my three things that I like about 1932's The Island of Lost Souls. First, this is pre-code, so there's some pretty tough stuff in here. There are themes explored here that you would likely never have seen approached, at least in this era of film. You have torture with Moreau working on his Beastmen in the lab, which is dubbed the House of Pain. Obviously, Moreau is playing God as well by slicing and dicing animals to turn them into humanoid creatures. There's another religious element as well, with the Beastmen coming to the realization that they no longer are bound to Moreau's laws. It's the creation rebelling against the creator, as if to make a statement that God no longer has a place after a society reaches a certain self-awareness or a need for social evolution. Then, well, there's an element of bestiality, with Moreau introducing the cat lady Lotta to Parker to find out if she will fall in love with him, and in turn, if she's human enough for Parker to fall in love with her. This is a movie that the UK banned for decades. The British Board of Film Censors refused its certificates to play in the country in several different years throughout the 30s and 40s and into the 50s. The British, it was basically the British Board of Film Censors had issues with things like vivisection, the cruelty of animals, and the themes and about the evolutionary stuff were seen as repulsive and unnatural. That was their actual notes on that. So a few cuts were made, and eventually the film would get released in 1958, but with an X rating. And man, between this film censors boards and the Mary Whitehouse character, it's a wonder that the Brits ever saw anything good. Second, the climax is pretty gruesome. We watch Lotta and Oron kill each other in hand-to-hand combat. She claws his throat out, he basically snaps her in two. Meanwhile, the Sayer of the Law, who is our good friend Bela Lugosi in another fantastic performance, leads the Beastmen in the charge to ultimately destroy Moreau. They claw at him as a mob, and when he reminds the Beastmen that they are at the House of Pain, hoping to trigger their fear about being created there, in pain, I might add, that backfires horribly, as Bela is like, oh yeah, the House of Pain, let's do that. And they take him in screaming and struggling and thrashing about to the lab where they kill him. And it's also kind of poetic, too, that the only thing they could do was to rebel and destroy their creator before they themselves were destroyed. I know the Brits thought the evolutionary shit was disdainful, but anything that defied their creators ended up dead in this movie. So, I mean, what's the deal there? It kind of seems like if you defy your creator, you end up dying anyway. So it's really interesting, the mindset of the censor board in the UK, because we look at this now 80 years later or 90 years later now almost and think, wow, this movie is just interesting. It's still within a certain percentage or a certain degree of a 1930s film that isn't going to show nudity or anything like that. But there is still a consequence for rising up against your creator in this. So it's just kind of interesting that they find one thing disdainful, but don't realize that the thing that they don't like also kind of gets punished in this movie too. I digress. Third, Charles Laughton is fantastic as Moreau. He's totally mad, but not really cartoonish about it. He's so singularly focused on his research that he is almost emotionless about what he does, except when he's giddy over his achievements. There's a scene in which he is talking to Parker about what he's done in his work, and there's just this gleam in his eye, a giddiness to his expression. Hell, he even leans on an operating table in such a way to almost show how playful he is in explaining his brilliance. And that's the thing about his performance. He is brilliant. He's a mad scientist who isn't trying to take over the world with a super weapon or an army of his beastmen. He's just discovered how to become a god. There's also a fey quality to his performance that is unmistakable too. And I don't think it was meant to make him homosexual, even though Laughton was bisexual himself. But really he's not interested in anything but his work. Laughton was married to Elsa Lanchester for over 30 years. Of course, she's forever remembered as the Bride of Frankenstein. And he was 3 times nominated for Best Actor Oscars, having won one in 1933 for The Private Life of Henry VIII. He also had a lengthy career on stage and even directed some plays. Generally, he's remembered as a marvelous actor. Daniel Day-Lewis cites him as one of his inspirations. And Day-Lewis says that you can't take your eyes off of him when he's on screen. And at least in Island of Lost Souls, that is very, very true. Well, that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. Don't forget to check out new episodes of Film Seizure every Wednesday and a new installment of Monster Mondays each Monday on FilmSeizure.com, as well as places where fine podcasts are found, like SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Spotify. Additionally, hop on over to Facebook and Twitter to follow us by just searching for Film Seizure. You can also check out new posts at my website, bmovieenema.com, each and every Friday. So, until next week, stay spooky.